I got stuck in a rut here recently, guys. That's why I haven't posted in a while. Much of my aim on the channel has been to talk about and discover the truth. It's what I valued above almost everything. It's why I left Mormonism and Christianity, but as a rule, for humanity in general, should we know the truth? I used to think we should. Contemplating this more and more, I realized my justification for thinking so was very problematic. I got bogged down by this question, paralyzed to some degree, realizing that if there are insufficient grounds to say people should know the truth, then why talk about it? Why struggle so much pursuing it? Psychologists Taylor and Brown pointed out the implication.
Don't miss this upcoming insight.
If persons with low self-esteem and depression are actually those well anchored in reality, and the rest of the population is to some extent distorting reality in a positive direction in order to maintain a state of non-depression, then one of the criteria for mental health may have to be the maintenance of positively distorted perceptions of self.
I got out of my predicament because I didn't live in my current reality.
Dr. Seligman is very famous for doing studies on optimism. And in those studies, you know what he found out? People that are pessimists are much more realistic. They're much more accurate.
Anyway, should we know the truth? The focus of this video is to investigate that question, and we'll get to that shortly because I desperately want to know the answer. But there's a lot in this question to unpack, so I suppose we should do that first before we attempt to answer it. The first thing to consider is what should occur. This word could be replaced with ought, and if you're familiar with Hume's work at all, you'll know that there's a lot to be said about what ought to be. For our question today, ought we know the truth? The answer will vary significantly depending on the value hierarchy of the respondent. Human well-being ranks very high in that hierarchy in our species, so that will be assumed as our underlying framework. And there's a lot to address within that scope. Many people value the prosperity of plants and other animals over human well-being. Many more value an invisible man written of in ancient books over the value of Homo sapiens. These are important ideas, but we'll have to save that discussion for another video. Suffice it to say, my aim is to understand if more knowledge of the truth will have a net positive influence on our well-being, or if it will reduce our well-being. I began to think about this question after escaping Christianity. I contemplated the possibility that if we believe in certain falsehoods, maybe it's beneficial to our well-being. I wondered, if I influence people to leave Abrahamic theism, is that actually helping people live the best possible life? Okay, so let's unpack this just a bit further. We first have to address what is meant by the truth. The truth has many forms and exists within many contexts. In almost all circumstances, the truth has an element of time incorporated with it, whether that be past, present, or future reality. For example, is it true that in the year 2030, Ukraine will not exist? Or is it true that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue? The truth comprehensively is what has occurred in the past, all that is occurring in present reality, and everything that will occur in future reality. Our question isn't as much concerned with a complete knowledge of truth in all situations as it is with an increased degree of knowledge of that comprehensive truth. The more precise question we will try to answer then is, if human beings generally gain a higher degree of knowledge of past, present, and future reality, will it provide a net positive increase of well-being in Homo sapiens on balance? Furthermore, if it is shown that increased knowledge brings increased well-being, does this relationship exist consistently all the way up until we reach a comprehensive knowledge of all truth? Or is there a point for Homo sapiens where too much knowledge of the truth becomes a severe detriment to our well-being? If our well-being improves commensurate to the degree we know the truth, is this relationship linear or exponential as our knowledge increases? Now that we better understand our question, should we know the truth, let's look at the impact truth has had or potentially could have had in certain situations. It's important to keep in mind as we go through these examples and situations that this is not to assert the net effect of humans knowing the truth ultimately, but rather to identify what knowledge of the truth does in certain cases. It's quite clear increased knowledge of reality increases our well-being in countless circumstances. If we know where a spring is located in a desert climate, we will be able to survive longer than if we didn't know where any water was. If we know a predator is stalking us in the forest, we will be able to better defend ourselves from an attack. These examples are ample and intuitive. Let's look at an example with some religious implications. Sharon Amos was a People's Temple cult member who slit the throats of her 3 children in Jonestown.
God Almighty, God Almighty. It's just too late. It's too late. The Congressman's dead. The Congress today's dead. Death is... I tell you, I don't care how many screams you hear. I don't care how many anguished cries. Death is 1,000,000 times preferable to 10 more days of this life. If you knew what was ahead of you, you'd be glad to be stepping over tonight.
They aren't crying from pain. It's just a little bitter tasting, but they're not crying out of any pain.
The way the children are laying there now, I'd rather see them lay like that. Die with respect, die with a degree of dignity. Lay down your life with dignity. Don't lay down with tears and agony. Children, it will not hurt if you'll be quiet. If you'll be quiet.
Would it have been beneficial for her to know the truth? That Jim Jones wasn't a god and that nuclear apocalypse wasn't about to take place? If she knew the truth, she, for one, would have likely enjoyed the economic prosperity of the United States instead of moving to the jungle of Guyana. She likely would not have died in such a gruesome manner, and she would have likely lived decades longer. We don't know exactly what her future would have been had she not been under the spell of Jones, but I think we can say her life likely would have been better had she known the truth. We can say this for over 600 adults who followed Jones to the jungle and drank the Kool-Aid, killing themselves and their children. Conversely, there are situations in which knowledge of the truth can be detrimental to human well-being. It's not as instinctive to see how this could be, but I have thought of some examples. The mid-20th century brought with it an increased degree of knowledge of nuclear physics, which ultimately led to the creation of the most powerful and destructive force the world has ever known. When we gained more knowledge about the world around us, we weaponized it.
Oppenheimer teaches us that the purity of intentions can still have the most profound and negative unintended consequences.
The atomic bomb killed over 100,000 people in Japan and remains a very real threat to human well-being today as the world suffers from Putin's reckless ego.
President Vladimir Putin says
If there is infidelity within marriages or other relationships, those involved are usually in decent general health, while the relationship may not be, as long as one of the parties is ignorant of it. When knowledge is gained of infidelity by one individual in the partnership, it commonly leads to suicide and murder. Researchers Neal and Lemay and Nemeth et al. Concluded intimate partner violence is consistently triggered by knowledge of infidelity. In Texas, until about 50 years ago, the paramour law justified a husband in killing someone engaging in adultery with his wife. And until 1991, Brazilian men lawfully executed their wives after becoming aware of their adultery. Various types of people with bad character gain particular knowledge of reality and use it to cause harm. Other examples are active cyber criminals knowing your bank username and password, everyone in New York knowing the door code to your investment property in the Hamptons, jihadists knowing my address, etc. Knowing the truth may inhibit each of us individually from reaching our highest potential degree of well-being. This would be harmful, at least in some respect. The association between perceiving reality more accurately and depression has been termed pessimistic realism. It has been tested and is supported by some data. Researchers Dobson and Franch published their relevant findings in the Canadian Journal of Behavioral Science, stating, "There is convincing evidence that depressed persons are more realistic in judging response outcome contingencies than non-depressed persons." You can see these citations in the screen or in the description. Psychologists Taylor and Brown pointed out the implication that, quote, "If persons with low self-esteem and depression are actually those well anchored in reality, and the rest of the population is to some extent distorting reality in a positive direction in order to maintain a state of non-depression, then one of the criteria for mental health may have to be the maintenance of positively distorted perceptions of self and the world." Here's Tony Robbins on the subject.
Dr. Seligman is very famous for doing studies on optimism. And in those studies, you know what he found out? People that are pessimists are much more realistic. They're much more accurate. If you give them a test and you ask them to look at something and give you a size measurement of it, or to evaluate their own success or failure at a task, and every study Seligman's done, he did it in University, I think Pennsylvania, if I remember correctly, originally, what he found was that optimists always see themselves as doing better than they really did. They basically BS themselves. What happens to pessimists, they're 10 times more accurate. But here's what he found out. What he found out is because the people who are accurate never push themselves because they know it's never going to work anyway. Whereas the optimist sees it better than it is, so they keep doing it. Because they have the illusion they did well, I'll do even better next time. And because of that optimism, they did it more often, and so optimists succeed at a 4 to 5-fold, depending upon the task, result ultimately beyond anything that a pessimist will do, and they're not as accurate. All that's a big way of saying is, if you can develop a psychology of resilience in yourself, you don't have to be optimistic or fake, you can be real. The realness is, whatever shows up, you are larger than anything that can happen to you.
Professor of philosophy Ken Gemmis touches on the subject as well.
In an everyday sense, we can see illusions as very, very important. Think about a sportsman. It turns out that most really prime sportsmen have incredible overinflation of their abilities. But that overinflation of ability, that illusion, helps them perform better. And to give a last case that is often given in epistemology classes, allegedly there are statistical evidence for the claim that if you are trapped behind enemy lines, let's say this was in the Second World War and the Vietnam War, you had, let's say, an 80% chance of being captured, right? But if you believed, I think of and I'm an American citizen, so I can say this without sounding anti-American. If you're extremely American gung-ho and you say, I'm the guy who's going to survive, that increases your chances of being, that means your chances of being captured. Before they were 80%, now they go down to 65%, let's say. I'm pulling these numbers out of the air. So on the basis of the evidence, that is, if you're thinking merely epistemically, that is being sensitive to the evidence, you'd still think on the balance of probabilities, I'm going to be captured. But if you can get yourself over that belief through illusion and tell yourself, oh no, I'm not going to be captured, it has the pragmatic effect of lessening your chance of being captured. So you can see why it's in your best interest. So I'm just giving you these cases where in everyday life and in exceptional cases, it helps to have illusions. Illusions are necessary often to animate our activity.
Sam Harris and Professor of Cognitive Philosophy Andy Clark give another example of this in a different context.
How does this account for other aspects of experience like emotion and motor behavior? And I mean, maybe we want to take each of these at a turn. And I'm thinking especially things like pain. And I mean, there's this wide literature on things like, placebo and nocebo effects and, pain and functional illness being, in many cases, driven by one's expectations.
So I think pain is, we all know this in a way. It's sort of, if the dentist says expect a tickle, they're saying that for a reason. They're trying to frame those sensations that you're going to get in a way that really will dampen the experience of pain just a little bit. And there are controlled experiments showing that expectations of intense pain will up the pain rating, and expectations of less intense pain will down the pain rating, even when what's being delivered is, an intermediate stimulus.
So is the claim that we mostly consciously experience our predictions and are continually revising them, with attending to sensory inputs, or is it that all we experience is our predictions and that the sensory input is really always unconsciously modifying our predictions, and it's a, as Arnold Seth called a controlled hallucination, but it's the control component is always happening in the dark.
Yes, that's the way I see it.
I got out of my predicament because I didn't live in my current reality. Had I lived in my current reality, I would still be in my reality that was constructed for me. Mm-hmm. So I had to live in this realm that was dreamt of, and my whole premise was to manifest that dream with strategy. So I had to live as if it was real. I had to live like I already moved my mom out the projects. I had to live like this gang doesn't want me. I'm no use for this gang. Why even get initiated and live that gang life? Let me just keep wearing these suits, because these suits that my mom made me are my attire for the world that I'm going to be living in. You have to live. If you living in some place that you know that you don't belong, you know you don't belong there. Why are you stuck in that?
If the truth becomes known by a person at the wrong time, this is detrimental to their well-being. Let's say it's the night before the Wimbledon finals, and a player's mother, who loved them and taught them everything they know about tennis, dies in a gruesome car accident. This finalist should not know the truth about the gruesome death of their mother until after they play out the match the next day, so they are able to play at their fullest capacity. There are simply inappropriate times for certain truths to be discovered. Other examples of this would be revealing the death of a loved one to someone right before their honeymoon, or telling an 8-year-old boy the reason for their parents' divorce is because his father had sex with another woman. If we knew the truth in its totality, it may harm our ability to function and behave healthily. This is a hypothetical example, but there may be a point where we gain too much knowledge, and that data overload may inhibit us from focusing on what's important to our survival. It's not by accident our knowledge of reality has limitations. A species struggling to thrive and evolve within its environment would likely have a degree of knowledge commensurate to the degree that it is beneficial for that species to thrive. Not much more, not much less. This seems like a question of efficiency. It would be a waste of resources to know certain things about reality that are not beneficial to the species. The cognitive scientist Dr. Hoffman has studied this at length.
Whatever reality is, it's not what you see. What you see is just an adaptive fiction. Fitness is not the same thing as reality as it is, and it's fitness and not reality as it is that figures centrally in the equations of evolution. So in my lab, we have run hundreds of thousands of evolutionary game simulations with lots of different randomly chosen worlds and organisms that compete for resources in those worlds. Some of the organisms see all of the reality, others see just part of the reality, and some see none of the reality, only fitness. Who wins? Well, I hate to break it to you, but perception of reality goes extinct. In almost every simulation, organisms that see none of reality but are just tuned to fitness drive to extinction all the organisms that perceive reality as it is. So the bottom line is evolution does not favor vertical or accurate perceptions. Those perceptions of reality go extinct. Now, this is a bit stunning. How can it be that not seeing the world accurately gives us a survival advantage? That is a bit counterintuitive. We do not see reality as it is. We're shaped with tricks and hacks that keep us alive.
Dr. Zabine Damania also lends some insight.
Organisms that see any aspect of reality as it is go extinct in just a few generations, whereas organisms that see reality as a fitness icon designed to help them reproduce thrive. So in other words, there is no bottle of water here as such. There's no water, there's no atoms, there's no paper, there's none of that. This is a graphical user interface that I as a human have evolved to see to help me survive. I see something wet that I know that if I drink it, I will not die. And so we have this shorthand hack in how we see the world.
A modern philosopher by the name of Saul Smilansky is convinced humanity is better off ignorant of certain truths. In an interview with The Atlantic, he said, quote, "We cannot afford for people to internalize the truth about free will. If everyone accepts that there is no free will, then I'll know what people will say." Whatever he did, he had no choice. We can't blame him. So I know I'm not going to be condemned for taking the selfish option. The more people accept the determinist picture, the worse things will get. Smilansky advocates for the view he calls illusionism, the belief that free will is indeed an illusion, but one that society must defend. The idea of determinism and the facts supporting it must be confined within the ivory tower. Only the initiated behind those walls should dare to look the dark truth in the face. Smolansky says he realizes that there is something drastic, even terrible about this idea, but if the choice is between the truth and the good, then for the sake of society, the truth must go. Truth, though, still persists as beneficial in some way. Consider the fact that there is definitely a way to make all human beings the most happy and healthy that they can possibly be. We don't seem to know the method to achieve that right now, but with an increased degree of knowledge, with an increased degree of familiarity with the truth, we would know this method to achieve the maximum potential well-being for humanity. If we had more knowledge, a clearer picture of the avenue to achieve that, human well-being would then have a higher likelihood of increasing to its fullest potential, because then we may implement that method. Thus, truth is extremely beneficial to Homo sapiens. Also, it seems to be true that truth is not always beneficial to people, and that piece of truth surely factors into the equation significantly. This video is not dispositive in any way. I really would appreciate any insight, critique, commentary that you may have to offer. Let's figure this out.